speaker is Rana Tabrizi, Auditory Preferences of Children with Autism.
Hi, my name is Rana Tabrizi, and my advisors are Dr. Sarah Creel and Dr. Karen Pierce, and Micah here, grad student, is also helping me out with my project. And I was studying auditory preferences of children with autism. So autism is very prevalent in society right now. Like, a lot of people know a little bit about it, but about 1 in every 100 children are diagnosed with autism. So it can be very devastating for a family to receive that diagnosis. And it's devastating because there's a lot of things that we use in our daily lives that are affected when you have autism. There are 3 things that commonly characterize it. The first thing is reduced social interaction. The second is a deficit in communication. And the third is restrictive interests and repetitive behaviors. So if you take a look at the literature, you'll find a huge emphasis on early diagnosis, and you might wonder why that is. So basically you can kind of catch autism as early as 18 months, which is a really good thing because the earlier you catch autism and the earlier you start doing treatment, the more impactful the potential of the treatment could be. So that's why there's a huge emphasis on that in the literature, and researchers actually consider 3 or 4, even 5 years old as a really late diagnosis. So for this reason, I've chosen to kind of continue to develop more diagnostic measures, making them more far-reaching. So a lot of the current literature actually focuses on the visual domain. And if we want to find diagnostic measures that are as robust as possible, maybe we can think about exploring other sensory modalities. So what I've done is explored the auditory domain and auditory preferences in particular. So auditory preferences can be anything from speech to sounds to music, just anything that children prefer to hear in their natural environment. So if we're taking a look at these auditory preferences under the umbrella of early diagnosis of autism, we might want to head back to those 3 criteria that I talked about at the beginning. So infant-directed speech is something that's commonly used by parents and facilitates those 2 things we first talked about, social interaction and communication. So infant-directed speech is kind of that exaggerated intonation that you'll hear parents use with their little kids. Hi, sweetie, how are you? And so parents often use that to aid language development and assist their kids in paying attention to language and affect. So interestingly, Fernald and Poole have found that as early as 4 months old, children are actually showing a preference if they're typically developing for this infant-directed speech, and when it's paired with adult-directed. And years later, Poole did another study that showed that we have reason to believe that kids with ASD don't have the same preference. So 2 to 4-year-olds with an ASD actually prefer non-speech analog signals when they're paired with that same infant-directed speech. These analog signals are just kind of like synthesized sine waves that don't really have the same semantic content as language does. So both of these things are really important for studying autism, or can be, and can really influence our diagnosis. So what I've chosen to do is explore whether this same preference for non-speech analogs maybe can translate into a younger population. And what I've done is tested whether or not kids with autism have a preference that differs from typically developing kids when you pair infant-directed speech instead with a monotone speech, or a speech that kind of lacks affect or prosody. So there were a couple other studies that also influenced making another part to my paradigm. So if we have the hypothesis that kids with autism won't actually prefer infant-directed speech, then what will they show an affinity towards? So Lay and colleagues did a really interesting study recently using fMRI. So what they did is they found, they got kind of paired speech and song together and exposed them to children, and found that functional systems in the brain that process speech and song are actually more engaged in reaction to song in children with an autism spectrum disorder than typically developing kids. So this kind of guided me to also tweak the first part of my paradigm a little bit and make a second part where I instead paired infant-directed speech with music. So we might expect that kids with autism might have more of an affinity for that music. And interestingly enough, Pierce and colleagues did something that kind of had to do with that third criteria I talked about, the repetitive interests and behaviors. So they found that toddlers with an autism spectrum disorder actually prefer geometric patterns over social images. So if we want to tie that back in and bring that third criteria back in to the paradigm, what we can do is see if this interest for repetitive visual stimuli actually applies to the auditory domain. So what I've done is that I've made the musical stimulus also repetitive in nature. So several of the studies that I talked about before use head turn as a measure of preference. And something difficult about that is that it's not very efficient to replicate. And since we're looking for something that can improve diagnostic measures as much as possible, we can look to something like eye tracker, which has the potential to be used with kids of all functional abilities and ages, and can be more easily replicated. So basically what the eye tracker does is a subject will be exposed to a screen similar to that, and it bounces infrared lights off of the child's pupil and bounces them back to the screen, and it just detects where your eye is in space and its movement. And if you kind of see that happening in real time, you'll see something like this right here, dots representing each of the movements of the eye fixating on a particular place on the screen. So for my experiment, I talked about how I chose to kind of bring the age back a little bit, all the way to 13 to 45 months. So that was the pool of subjects that I tested. And all of the subjects were referred to the Autism Center of Excellence using a screening method, and it's called the 1 Year Well Baby Checkup. And so what that does is basically screens for kids who might have developmental disorder of some type or an ASD, and the typically developing kids were referred through community referrals. So what happens once they get to the center is that all of these kids are run on the eye tracker, and then they go through a series of standardized assessments. And luckily, I'm able to pull from those scores to use for my own study to see if there's any correlations with how they do with the eye tracker in these standardized assessments. So one of the things that's tested is kind of a developmental quotient in the Mullen, and so that's kind of comparable to an IQ or intelligence quotient for older individuals. And there's also subcategories that we find scores for there. So what are their language abilities, for instance? So I'm going to be using their receptive language scores in my analysis later. And they also get run on another test, the ADOS, and that kind of shows where are they on this spectrum potentially of autism, are they at risk or not. So for my first paradigm, after weeding out subjects for various reasons I'll explain later, I had about 16 subjects for the first paradigm and 39 for the second. So we kind of split them into 3 different categories based off of their diagnoses. So the first is ASD, another is typically developing kids, and then language delay or developmental delay, and then an other diagnosis is just that last category. So for the procedure, we basically sit the kid in the parent's lap, and it's set up kind of similar to this, and they're facing this screen here. And so first they're exposed to training trials. So this is kind of what they see on the screen minus the text. So this is what's kind of called a gaze contingent display. So every time a child looks at a particular image, it activates a particular sound file to play. So in this left image, as soon as the child looks over there, an infant-directed speech file will start playing that auditory sample. As soon as they blink or look away, it'll stop. And then when they look here, instead they'll hear monotone speech. So we're basically just using these visuals as a medium for studying auditory preference. So you notice that these images are nearly identical. They're only different in that they're wearing different hats. But the reason that they're slightly different is just so that we can emphasize to the child that there is a distinction to be made between the two, but not different enough so that they start associating preference with the images rather than the sounds. So I'm going to be playing a little bit of each. First I'll play the infant-directed speech.
Hi, my sweetie. How are you? Are you hungry? Do you want some food? How about some milky? Mommy loves you.
So there's about 60 seconds of that. So whenever the child focuses on that, it'll continue to loop. And then if they look at the other image, they'll hear this.
Hi, my sweetie. How are you? Are you hungry? Do you want some food? How about some milky? Mommy loves you.
I'd be a little frightened. But yeah, so that's essentially the first paradigm where we're pairing this infant-directed speech with monotone speech. And then in the second paradigm, we talked about how I just tweaked it a little bit. So rather than pairing infant speech with monotone speech, we switched it out for music. So we talked about how we would expect more of a preference in ASD kids for that music. So this is what this would sound like.
Hi, my sweet.
So each of the kids that was only run on either one of these paradigms since it has overlapping auditory stimuli and we don't want to expose them to the same thing more than once in the same session. So what we would expect from that first paradigm is that typically developing children will actually show greater preference for infant-directed speech since they presumably have greater language abilities. And in that second paradigm, we would expect the kids with ASD to prefer music more than the typically developing children would. And then on top of that, what I expected to find was that the receptive language scores of the children would actually be positively correlated with their preference for infant-directed speech. So what I assumed was that the greater your language ability is, the greater your potential will be to prefer language. So before I did my analysis, I had to exclude quite a bit of participants for various reasons. The first is that we run all children regardless of diagnosis because we don't know what their diagnosis is until after the session. So after this happens, I kind of have to weed out all the people that don't neatly fall into those three criteria that I talked about. This could be some other type of developmental delay, ADHD, anything else. Those kids who didn't look at least 50% of the time could also be weeded out, and the child could just be fussy or be throwing a tantrum. So for the first paradigm, we actually didn't collect enough to do any valid data analysis on that, so I'm going to continue to collect data. But for the second paradigm, we found some interesting results. I basically split up on the x-axis here we have diagnosis, and on the y we have the language preference. So you'll see we split them up by groups. So ASD is the first, the typically developing kids are in the middle, and the language delays are all the way on the right. So you'll see what we expect in here is that controls show more of a preference for language, and then they're followed by the language delayed individuals, and then they're followed by autism spectrum disorder. So even though these were all trends, so they weren't statistically significant, but I hypothesized that if we were to collect more data, then we might see the same trend. And this is just another representation of that same thing. So instead we kind of collapsed across all subjects and took a mean, and we see that on average controls prefer listening to the infant-directed speech more than ASD kids do. And lastly, for that hypothesis I had with the correlations, it actually proved to be opposite of what I thought. So here we have receptive language scores on the x-axis, and percent language preference on the y-axis. So here we'll see that for kids with ASD, it's a trend, not statistically significant, but a trend that the higher their receptive language scores are, the lower their preference will be for hearing the infant-directed speech. And then for controls, we're not trending, but we see there's a difference in that preference. So that's interesting in itself that there's they don't have the same preferences. A hypothesis I could make is that perhaps it's been shown in the literature that there's kind of like a window of infant-directed speech of time that it's used by parents. So perhaps kids with higher language scores are kind of past that point of being interested in infant-directed speech, so that might be not why. But I'm going to continue to run further subjects and look into this. So just a couple improvements that could be made. If I play these auditory stimuli for you, right now they sound really coherent, but sometimes when the kids are looking, they just blink, it'll stop, and it'll be a little jittery. So if we can make that more cohesive, I think that would be a lot better to have the sessions run more smoothly. And I'm going to continue to gather additional data. So if these trends kind of continue to be seen in a larger pool of subjects and actually hold statistical significance, then we would be able to use auditory preferences potentially as some type of diagnostic measure. So we might be able to say that if a child does or does not prefer listening to infant-directed speech, we might be able to say something about their language ability. So it might be able to be used to improve amongst other procedures, can make those diagnostic procedures more robust.
Maybe if one were to sing what you were trying to say to an autistic, then the message might get through better.
Somebody actually suggested that to me yesterday. That was really good.
Just curious, I mean, I know you said you still need more data to do any real analyses for paradigm 1, but just, you know, eyeballing the data, what do you think you might find when you get more data?
I have reason to believe that my hypotheses would follow through, since that was I was going more off of what I saw in the research for that one. So I would expect that kids with an ASD would not show as much preference for infant-directed speech. I'm more confident in that, but yeah, we just didn't really have enough subjects.
Great, thank you.
Question, which is, so in the music version, if you see this sort of, the autistic participants were sort of balanced between preferring the speech and the music, which suggests that maybe they like something about the music. Do you think it's more the musicness of it or the repetitiveness of it?
That's something really interesting. I think we could do a separate study that teased apart something repetitive in nature that wasn't musical and something that was musical but not repetitive. But yeah, I think they had both of those components, so it would be hard to say which of those things were the
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna take a break and start up again at 11:20. Today was